Hello and welcome again to UCL Global Health. It's very difficult to be healthy if you live under occupation and insecurity. But in Palestine, the big hope for the people there who've suffered so much, it actually lies with lawyers. It lies with a future hope of a constitution for an independent state. And I'm joined by Sylvie Delacroix, who's reader in legal theory and ethics in the Department of Law here at UCL, and an expert on Middle Eastern law. So for Palestinians, they want a constitution, but it must be a bit of a nightmare because they're under all kinds of jurisdictions, what you've called a tossed legal salad. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, the situation is incredibly complicated. And in a way, this reflects the no less extraordinarily painful and complex history that has characterized that bit of land. And in the last 100 years, actually, it has had no less than 4 rulers, and each ruler has left a mark on the
Who are the 4?
So there's been the Ottoman Empire, there's been the British Mandate, there's been the Jordanian after the Second World War, and then there's been obviously the Israeli occupation. And so today, yes, we do have a tossed legal salad with bits of Ottoman, bits of Jordanian, bits of Egyptian, bits of British and bits of Israeli laws, all applicable depending on nationality, location, or subject matter. So things could actually have been very different, and it's important to know this.
So when you draft a constitution, or rather they draft one and you advise them, do you have to draw bits from all these different legal systems, or do you create a new one?
You don't have to do anything. Basically,
but you want to have some continuity, don't you?
Absolutely. And I think the key here is the word customary law, but I'll go back to that. But I mean, one thing that I want to say, and it's important to know it, is that the PLO 20 years ago did not manage to issue a constitutional draft when the first of the Oslo agreements was signed. And I think this is a key moment in history because things could have turned out very differently. Because it caused a lot of difficulties in that the emerging legal institutions 20 years ago were left without any clear non-Oslo legal ground. And Arafat's answer to that problem was bewildering because he just decided to issue a decree to reinstate the legal situation that existed prior to the 1967 Israeli occupation. So that meant the reinstatement of an impossibly eclectic patchwork of Jordanian, British, Israelis.
But come on to you mentioned customary law, and this touches on where the sources of power are within a community. And where exactly customary law, by that you mean the traditional systems of villages, committees coming together to decide what happens?
Okay.
Or not?
So what's the question? If the question is where the source of power lies for the moment in Palestine, I would say, first, it's an awkward question. It's a question that many people would rather not ask. But if you insist on asking it, then I suppose you could look at the basic law as it exists today, and they would say Article 2, the source of all power is the Palestinian people. Right. But actually, this hides a rather messy reality on the ground. And that messy reality is translated in the fact that today there are 2 parallel constitution making in Davos. Not many people know this. So on one hand, there's the basic law that was drafted and promoted by the Palestinian Authority and the legislative arm of the Palestinian Authority, which is the Palestinian Legislative Council. And then on the other hand, there's a constitution-making endeavor that's promoted by the PLO. And as the legislative arm of the PLO, the Palestinian National Council, PNC, is actually the only body that represents all segments of the Palestinian population worldwide.
And are these 2 constitutions similar or different?
They're not similar at all, in that currently, really, if anybody holds political power, it's the Palestinian Legislative Council, so the legislative arm of the PA, right? But there's been an increasing push, especially recently with all the UN business, etc., to try and re-empower the PLO, and particularly the legislative arm of the PLO, considering the fact that it's the only legitimate representative of all Palestinians worldwide.
One other interesting thing that you documented in your recent paper was a quote from Gandhi, and you said that after Indian independence, he said, we will have home rule, but we won't necessarily have self-rule. Right. And you draw that parallel with the Palestinians, that even if you get this constitution that's agreed, and presumably a settlement, assuming it would be a two-state settlement, you've then got the problem that you may have a constitution, but self-rule is involving every village. Is that right?
That's right. So Gandhi's words, and particularly that concept of Swaraj, I can't pronounce it.
Right.
That's how I pronounce it. They're really often quoted now by Palestinians because they denounce as misguided any attempt to establish a home rule, a home or government from the top down. And so the idea is that if you empower customary practices, if you allow them to lend their full, let's call it gravitas, to the burgeoning civic movement that exists on both sides of the fence, then you might stand a chance to actually create what Gandhi would call true self-rule or Swaraj. And this true self-rule or Swaraj was actually, interestingly, historically present, you could argue, during the first stages of the first Intifada.
Right.
So
there was, you record, was it 40,000 village councils?
Right. That's what I've read anyway. I wasn't there, but they claim anyway that each locality was creating what they call the popular committee, and this network of committees then issued leaflets which contain policies and laws, and these laws then borrowed from Jordanian and Egyptian law, but also most importantly from.
So this was when the sort of 80s. First Intifada?
Yes, 1988 beginning.
And what's happened now? Is that all dissipated, or have we still got the rudiments?
So, that's right. So customary law today is still very much in force in that, for instance, it's still used today to resolve conflicts outside the traditional civil and religious courts. And so there are cases of courts who consciously agree to suspend the sentence to allow for a binding settlement, a sul, to be issued.
So finally, are you optimistic? Do you think we're going to get towards an agreed constitution that Palestinians sign up to in the next 5 years?
You know, when I first worked on this, I was very enthusiastic and very optimistic because I thought, well, I was biased by the fact that I was a philosopher working on revolutions. And I thought this is a unique opportunity to look at a constitution in the making. You don't often get a chance to talk to people who are actually drafting it. So initially I was very enthusiastic, but the more I spent time working on this, talking to people, I then came to realize that it was very much an outward-looking effort. It's so linked to this effort to gain international recognition. And I think in the process it has lost touch with some of the more, how would you call it, roots of what Palestinians are really attached to, what they want to promote, their aspirations, basically. And I think customary law might well be a good departure point if you want to create something sustainable in terms of legal system.
Sylvie, thank you very much.
Thank you.